Aizen is one of Argentina's most distinguished journalists, who served for many years as United Nations correspondent for a major wire service. Among the stories she covered was the 1992 Environmental Summit in Rio de Janeiro, and that, she says, is where she got hooked on environmental stories. She later became the New York correspondent for Clarin, Argentina's largest newspaper, and then returned to Argentina in 2003 to cover the country's debt crisis. She moved on to work for Viva, the Sunday magazine of Clarin. She's won several international awards for her environmental journalism, most recently the United Nations Correspondents Association's Global Prize for her coverage of climate change, presented to her by Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. She recently completed a book on the Mendoza Case, the remarkable legal action that led the Supreme Court of Argentina to order and enforce a comprehensive rehabilitation program for the Riachuelo River in Buenos Aires. The Riachuelo was once identified as the 8th most polluted spot on the planet, but not anymore.
I thought pollution was important, but as I went through the investigation, the research of my book, I realized that pollution wasn't that important. That the important part was the relationship of the people in the Riachuelo basin, how the Riachuelo the pollution was a reflection of all the bad things about the economic, political, and environmental system. It wasn't so much about the quality of the water, it was about how people treated each other, and that was reflected in the water. So it got even more fascinated because I started with dirt and I ended up with people and with the minds of people and what people thought about themselves and what the impact of their thoughts were reflected on the river.
That's fascinating. So, how were what were the thoughts that you thought felt were responsible for the problem? What kind of thinking?
I thought that there was a bunch of bad guys in all factories that were responsible for the problem, and as I later realized that wasn't exactly true. It was the whole historical approach of society towards the river that made the problem big. Riachuelo pollution is not only due to bad industrial practices, but also of a mismanagement of the territory. What do I mean by that? For instance, the sewage system was outgrown by the population in the metropolitan area. Nobody thought about that for many, many years. And why has not anybody thought about this? It's because Argentina got stuck after the 50s. Argentina had a very interesting growth that we could compare it to Canada, really. But after the 50s, the country stopped thinking about the about the future and the infrastructure. All the work that has been done by previous generations were completely stalled. And of course, that had to have an impact on the river where all the people came to settle down. At the outskirts of the city, the metropolitan area really exploded after the 30s and the 40s and the 50s. When Peronism came in 45, many people came to Buenos Aires to work, and there was a lot of farming land available to them, but the works needed for these people to settle down properly in the territory weren't there. So that had to have an impact in this small river that is called the Riachuelo. And so you have human waste that present in the river that is really polluting the waterways. And so I found a historical problem, the Argentine frustration there expressed in the Riachuelo.
When you talk about the historical, it actually goes back, way back further than the 1950s,
Sure.
right? There's almost, somebody said 200 years of pollution in the
And I
Riachuelo?
would say even more, 200 is just a fraction of the time that the Riachuelo was a problem. Since the Spaniards settled in this area, and Buenos Aires was founded twice in the very same location because of the Riachuelo, because the Riachuelo provided a natural port for the ships to be protected from the huge storms that we get in this area. So it's almost a miracle, and the miracle was provided by the Riachuelo. So when the Spaniards settled in, they started to take the wood out of the river banks, and that was the first cause of the first environmental problems. This area of the Pampas doesn't have naturally many trees. So when they took out the first trees to build up the houses and fortresses for Buenos Aires and to have wood to burn for heating and cooking, they left the river banks without the few trees that they have, and the first floods occurred in the area. And then the first industries settled down on the margins of Riachuelo. Industries obviously with no standards, like slaughterhouses and tanneries. So since this is a slow flowing river, immediately was polluted, and polluted not by chemicals, heavy metals, but by biological products. But for this river, the biological products were deadly, because since it flows so slowly, all the oxygen was consumed by the river. So it became a stinky river. You found the accounts of this river being polluted way, way back. And it's interesting how people complain about the situation of the river, and it never got fixed. Up to date. It really, after 500 years, the Spaniards settled down in this area, that we are really starting to think about this river in a different way.
After 500 years?
500 years, yeah.
Tanneries wouldn't normally be, that's not a source of pollution that I hear a lot about in other places, but it ties very closely to what Buenos Aires is.
Yeah. You see, Riachuelo is the product of the Pampas. The first Spaniards that came to found Buenos Aires, they left cutlery that went wild and reproduced itself. So that became like another resource, economic resource. So all the industries were built around cows, right? And cows, and in order to convert the cow skin into a thing that we call leather, you need heavy chemicals, heavy metals like chrome and other products that these industries used to dump into the river as if the river was a huge garbage can. So although the tanneries are not so many anymore, they used to be very important both in the colonial era and in the industrial era. And they used to be up to 500, now maybe they are only 150, but they are responsible for the contaminations with heavy metals and persistent chemicals.
It's interesting because you think of leather as a natural product.
It is not.
It is not, is it?
It is not. And Argentine leather was very sought for in the it was an export and a very important export of Argentina in both the colonial era and now. The leather industry is problematic, and besides, it's important to see who these companies are, where they come from. They come from Italy, and and even from one province in Italy called Avellino, and they've been working the same way for generations. You can go to see one owner of a factory here, and they've 4 or 5 generations have been working in the same factory, and that the first owner of that factory came from Avellino, and they have the same production processes for maybe more than a century. Very old production processes, and they are very dependent on the environment to be cheap. So they were externalizing costs on the whole society by polluting the Riachuelo. That was what made possible this leather, this quality leathers, to be so cheap, because they were dumping.
They weren't paying the full costs.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So now they have to internalize these processes, to these costs, and it's a whole new game for them.
You were saying that they're quite resistant to this because, I mean, this is the way we've done it for generations.
Exactly.
So who are you to come and tell?
Yes, and we worked so hard, and they thought the value of their work was more important than the value of this river. This river was a dump, so why would you consider it important? And also, you have to consider political corruption here, because these tanneries are settled down in a district that was governed by the same guy for 30 years. And this guy had no records of the industry settled down in his territory. He was making money by extracting, political support and money support from them. So these tanneries thought they had all the papers, up to date, and all of a sudden comes a new government agency and tells them, hey, look, you can't do things like that anymore. And for them, it was like talking in Chinese. They couldn't understand what was going on. So that's why it was so difficult for them. Of course, tanneries are not the only one to blame in the Riachuelo pollution. There are at least 3 types of industries that have to do with this situation. First are the slaughterhouses that were also dumping their byproducts on the water. Then you have, I don't know how you call it in English, galvanoplastias,
Petrochemicals?
No, not petrochemicals. It's those industries that, work with metals. They do the zinc.
Okay, yes.
I don't know how they call it in English.
Yes. Kind of metal bashing industries,
Exactly.
right? Yeah,
And
chrome plating, that kind of thing.
You have many small of those industries, and they go dump the products, mercury, zinc, whatever you want to think of, into the waterways. And of course the tanneries.
And then further upriver, there's the agricultural runoff, right? At the headwaters, more towards the headwaters, right?
Yeah. You have to think of the river, that the river is like the tree, like a tree, and then you have these branches, coming off the trees. All these creeks feed the main waterway. Small creeks, 200 creeks, more than 200 creeks. So you start polluting the creeks, you pollute the main river, and you have a whole metropolitan area settled down around these creeks. And that's another thing that I have not thought about when I started my investigation, that it was not a river, it was a metropolitan area.
A metropolitan
area.
Yes?
I wouldn't know where I live if I had not done this research. It's like Antolin said this morning, by looking into the Riachuelo, you realize a whole basin, about the whole basin, that you never thought of that in that terms before. And that was so fascinating to me to discover all the human processes that go around the basin, the sewage system, the garbage, the poor, the rich, how companies have been polluting the river. So it's a very complicated combo that was fascinating to discover.
Almost like discovering that there's a biological kingdom, as it were, or a biological jurisdiction.
Yes.
And it's all cut up with human jurisdiction, so you don't actually see the whole, right?
Exactly. And all the subtle relationships, hidden relationships between people, among people. And it was fascinating. Yeah.
So this goes on for 500 years, right?
Yeah.
In various forms, and more modern forms of pollution, more ancient forms, and the old ones don't stop, right? The tanneries are there from the time of the Spaniards, and they're still there.
They're still there.
But then on top of them, you get all the new ones, right?
Yeah.
And this goes on like this until something happens with a woman named Beatriz Mendoza.
Well, it's not exactly like that. I know it's nice to think about
it's a starting point.
A human history, but it's a more complicated process, like everything in life. There are no really individual heroes, and I don't want to talk badly about Beatriz. I think she's being very courageous, but
But the time was right. Huh?
The time was right because of a particular reason. I mean, the lawsuit had been presented to the courts 2 years before the Supreme Court really took the case. And why the court took the case in that particular moment? We have a paper mill settling down in Uruguay, in the river Uruguay, that was very much resisted by the community across the river in a city called Gualeguaychú. The movement grew to be so big that governments in both sides of the Uruguay River had to intervene. It was a huge Finnish paper mill called Botnia. And there was a big political movement around that issue. You have to think, Uruguay and Argentina are like brother countries. So it was the first time Argentina and Uruguay were facing each other because of an environmental problem, and that environmental problem was this paper mill. So all of a sudden, an environmental issue was up in the air, and the Supreme Court grabbed this case and said, okay, the time is right to talk about the environment. Let's talk about the Riachuelo. We're talking about Uruguay, now let's talk about Riachuelo, down here where where the national government is settled. And the Gualeguaychú issue provided the framework, the political framework for this case to go ahead. The case, in a sense, backfired for the suers, for the people that was suing, because they sued for compensation and damages, and the court didn't want to hear that part. And that issue remains unresolved. But the court did take the case of damages for the whole society, not for an individual group of people. Daños colectivos, collective damages. So that's how the case, the Mendoza case, triggered the cleanup of the Riachuelo.
So it just provided the occasion.
It provided, the
when
excuse.
The court was ready,
Yeah, the excuse. But for her, it was just, she just lended her name. She was the first of 17 people that sued. Her name was the first name. It could have been called the Garcia case. But, well, she was the first person to sign, so it's called the Mendoza case. It's the Mendoza case and others.
Yes, Mendoza et al.
Exactly. But if it had not been for the work of many NGOs and the work of the Office of the Ombudsman coordinating these NGOs, that they have done so many studies that no governmental office did before, the case wouldn't have gone ahead. They provided information, the passion, the work. So I think that this is a story with many, many heroes, not just one hero.
No, I didn't mean to suggest that, but hers is indeed the name on the case. And there are 17 people then that decide to bring this case.
Yes.
What triggered that? Why did they, at that moment,
actually, Salaverry can explain it later. Before this cleanup process, there was another cleanup process that went awry, like many things in Argentina. It was called the 1,000-day process. It was done in the 90s. The government made this big announcement. There was a re-election of the previous president, Carlos Menem, coming up. So they decided to make a big announcement, and they say, okay, let's clean up the Riachuelo in 1,000 days. In that context, they inspected 44 industrial companies, like Shell, big tanneries, big slaughterhouses, the garbage company, 44 in total. And those inspections were kept in secret. So one day, the newspaper La Nación published an editorial complaining about these 44 inspections being kept secret. So Salaverry sees it and says, I wonder what's in there. And then he sees in my newspaper, Clarin, that there were a group of neighbors from Villa Inflamable complaining that their health was ruined because of the petrochemical activities going around that area. So he put the two together and convinced these people to sue the government.
And the 44 industries.
And the 44 industries.
Yeah. Let me just make it clear here that we're talking about Daniel Salaverry, who was the lawyer that carried this forward on behalf of that group of people.
Yeah, so he was the one that went to convince these people, please, let's sue the government. And they sued the government, and their case was sleeping for 2 years. And then Bosnia and Gualeguaychú occurred. So the court was smart enough to take this case as an excuse to trigger down the sentence.
Okay, so this is coming up. This case is kind of working its way slowly along. Nothing much is happening, and then you get the Uruguay River.
Yeah, exactly.
Thing, and the court says, "Oh, we have an opportunity here to do something that is in our jurisdiction." And I take it the other one is in Uruguay, right? So it's not in Argentina's jurisdiction at all.
No, but that case eventually went to The Hague. You see, Argentina sued Uruguay and lost. in The Hague for violating the Uruguay Treaty River. Uruguay River Treaty. Yeah, and I lost that case. So.
But this is one that's within Argentina, so the court can take jurisdiction and.
On itself.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now tell me about about how then there's a trial, right? Tell me about the trial. How does that unfold?
The trial had many parts, and it was a long trial, of course. And during the trial, all the companies would say, "It's not me who is polluting this river." To the point that one judge said, "Oh, I guess Riachuelo is polluting itself because nobody was to blame, really." So it took 2 years for the court to reach a decision, unanimous decision. And it was historical in many senses. It was the first time that a court in Argentina was talking about the environment, something that was never present in the political agenda. So it's interesting. Without the work of the NGOs and the civil society, I guess you wouldn't have that ruling. It's more than a bunch of people suing the government. It's the whole thing that made possible this.
Okay. So the process here is that the government holds, or the court holds hearings.
Yes.
And does some of its own investigations, I gather, eh?
Yes, they call the university. They use all the research that the Ombudsman office has done, and then they call the University of Buenos Aires to do a research.
And at the same time, all the NGOs and civil society groups are also feeding into the process, coming and making presentations at the hearings, talking to the investigators.
Yeah.
So you're getting quite a movement of people and quite a mass of knowledge. Yes.
Yes. And it was really thrilling to see for the first time the Riachuelo occupying that amount of paper space. Usually you had this one story, oh, how dirty, how disgusting this river is, and that's it. But for the first time, you got, action going on. Because the 1,000-day process was really, really nothing. They've done many studies on the river, but nothing really happened, nothing important happened beyond these studies. Nothing really moved. This time, the court say, okay, it has to go forward.
And that's partly because civil society is saying, enough talk already,
Yes,
let's do something.
exactly.
Huh? Yeah.
Exactly. Yes, I'm a big believer in civil society.
Yes, I can see that. But also, you touch on the role of the media. The media must have been taking this very seriously now too, right?
Not seriously enough. I think the media is still caught in this talk that this is a story with no end, a frustrating story, how disgusting, how horrible, how... I think the media hasn't still picked up on all the work that has been done on the basin. No, I think my book will be the first one coming from a journalist to reflect all the positive changes that have occurred. Oh, not only positive, how difficult it was to bring about these changes. That's important too, because it's not an automatic, axiomatic process that you go and do and that's done. You have to convince people to treat each other differently, to invest money, to think differently about your processes. It was a lot of work done in that sense. And societies are usually very resistant to change.
And journalism doesn't cover that kind of thing very well.
No.
It's not something that works in journalism.
No.
Although I assume as you went along here, as the various investigations were completed and so on, there would be coverage that would remind people that there is a thing going on here about the Riachuelo at the Supreme Court. There is a process, there will be a verdict.
Yeah,
Yeah?
from time to time.
Yeah.
From time to time.
But more than we would have seen earlier, right? It's not on the radar earlier, right?
Riachuelo has been on the media radar, as I told you. I said, wow, what a disgusting place. It was considered as a case without solution. Now that we are having some solutions, at least going on, they failed to see that story. It is kind of sad because there are things happening. And more people are thinking about the Riachuelo. But I guess when you are looking for newspaper headlines, you want impact. You want,
Now we get to the point where the court accepts the case, investigates the case, holds hearings, lots of people contribute, and there's by now quite a coalition wanting to see this thing go forward.
To tell you the truth, I don't think the court understood completely the impact of the ruling, or didn't understand the territory that much. Sometimes I get the feeling that the court didn't know what they were talking about, but that was good.
Yes. So they had no idea what a monster they were.
Of the complexity of the territory, because we're talking about poverty here in a big sense. And I don't think the court understood the social dynamic of the basin. So sometimes they demand action, but that action cannot be that quickly. Maybe the NGOs didn't understand it perfectly well. Till you don't get in the depths of the territory, you don't know what you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
You're talking about a map, you're talking about water, but not about the social complexity and dynamics of a certain basin. And that's why Antolin told you this morning that they are getting to know the territory they have to work on.
Yes.
The court didn't know. The NGOs didn't know it. And it's fascinating.
It is, isn't it? It's just, as you get deeper into it, it becomes more and more complex and more interesting, and more it's not about pollution, as you said at the beginning.
Yeah,
right?
it's about people.
Yeah. So the judgment comes down, and the judgment says, okay, there is going to be a new organization.
Yeah.
And the new organization has a reporting mechanism, and the court stays in as part of that reporting mechanism,
Yeah.
too, right? Tell me about Acumar and its situation.
Well, the Acumar has to report to court all the time. Every single action they do, they have to report to court. Of course, the Supreme Court designated an enforcement court that wouldn't be the court itself. It was a new court settled in the district of Quilmes, right outside the basin, with a very charismatic judge. And that judge had run into problems, political problems. So now we have two courts monitoring. There is a very complex work that has to be done in the Riachuelo. So it was wise for the Supreme Court to divide it into different courts. One court has to monitor the big public works that have to be done, like new sewage systems, new sewage treatment plants. That's very expensive public works. And the other court has to monitor the daily works of Acumar in the territory itself, like moving a slum, inspecting these industries. So this whole judicial backing of the ruling makes it go forward, especially with the monitor of the civil society too. So there is a very smart mechanism that makes the case move ahead despite the political troubles of Argentina that are constant.
Let me take you back for a moment to Acumar, because Acumar itself is a very interesting invention, right?
It is and it is really, and they started from zero. It's difficult to start a government agency from scratch.
And this is one that is designed to cover 3 jurisdictions and report to all 3 and be funded by all 3?
Well, Acumar law would say differently. I mean, there are political differences on who should fund Acumar. The people of Acumar that respond to the national government will say, no, it's all the parties involved that have to fund Acumar. But the city of Buenos Aires would tell you, no, it's a national law, the government, you see. So you have to understand there are big political divisions between the province of Buenos Aires, the city of Buenos Aires, and the national government. So for all the parties involved to make Acumar work was a little bit of, interesting work.
Well, in a sense, Acumar is an attempt to create a political
umbrella
counterpart, but a counterpart of your perception that this is a basin. It's not a series of streams. It's not, right? But this is this is looking over the whole thing, and that's brand new.
That's brand new, but it's been slowly more and more successful. But the final story hasn't been written yet. We have to see how it goes ahead with all the political shifts and movements in Argentina. The last 2 years, I think, have been the best years of Acumar, and the most progress has been done in the last 2 years. Let's see how it goes ahead. I don't know. I'm not going to write them a blank check.
No, but we can talk a little bit about what has been done. So we go now to the river, and we're not seeing anything like what we saw at the beginning. It's not a perfect river, but
it is amazing. It is frankly amazing because garbage has been dumped into the river, but people with their own hands have to pick it up. And that's remarkable, that somebody else has to pick up the stuff you left behind. So for that, people that work picking up garbage, I really, really admire, because they have to get dirty. It's one thing is to say, oh, please clean out the river. The other thing is pick up the dirt. So I really, so that's one thing, that the garbage has mostly picked up, and that companies have been, slowly adapting to the new rules. The rules are not perfect. More can be done, but you have to consider that Argentina has a very complicated economic situation. And for companies to invest a lot of money in this situation is something. They were not accustomed to do that. They were fine with the old industrial processes. They were fine with externalizing their costs. So for them, it's a new culture. And some companies really, and most of them are small companies, it was a big effort. But some people took as a new challenge facing the future, and the stuff they used to dump into the river, now they can use in a new industrial process, and expanding that industrial process to give value what they used to dump is fascinating. We are talking about sustainable development here. And this is a story that is not usually told when the media talks about Riachuelo. that we are making these companies sustainable. We are talking about the new era of economic development, and this is fascinating.
Yeah, you're forcing them to innovate.
Exactly, but they like it because, hey, I used to dump this product, now I can give value to it. I'm making a profit out of the garbage, what I used to consider garbage. And that's fascinating. I think it's fascinating.
And a number of the riverside shanty towns have been moved, eh?
Yes, and it's a complex process. People like where they live. There are opposite views about the very same thing. You see a guy living under the bridge, you think it's miserable, but the guy that lives under the bridge likes it. And so this whole textures of different stories, I found that was fascinating. No? I would consider the living under a bridge a miserable thing, but when I found this guy so proud about his home, the thing that he could build with cardboard under the bridge that provided a roof for his 4 or 5 kids, I wasn't expecting that. I was expecting him to complain about his situation, not to be proud of his situation. And I found that story repeatedly along the riverbanks. So when the government wanted to intervene, there was a whole new battle going on that needed a description. And I'm very happy I bumped into that story that I wasn't expecting at all.
Well, it's fascinating, isn't it, how as we talk about how many things turn out differently than you expect, and some things turn out to be easy and some things turn out to be much more difficult where you didn't think there would be a difficult.
Yeah, exactly. But that's nice because it's what makes you move, you know? Finding the unexpected.
Now, it must be a big industry, the cleanup itself, right? I mean, you've got people out there working to clean up the river, pull out the bottles, you know, deal with all the waste and so on and so forth. There's quite a few jobs just in that.
Yeah, and I am amazed that there are people that are looking forward to doing that job because it's a job. The poorest of the people had to pick up that garbage. Well,
there's an issue here about class too, right? Because what you had along the river were the people that had no place to go, and in many cases squatted, sometimes owned the land, but in many cases squatted and made a life for themselves along the edge of the river. And maybe part of the reason that the river wasn't really thought about very much was because it's only poor people, and who cares about them?
No, the poor people came later. The river was spoiled by industrial processes, and when more poor people and immigrants really also were coming into the city, they found this place that was forgotten by society, so they settled in there. The big slum that is on the riverside, the slum called 2124.
That's the one we went by.
Yeah, exactly. That slum, the land belongs to the National Railroad System. And so it's government, the federal government owns that land. But that land was not being used, was neglected. So whenever you see, many of the railroad company lands were taken by the poor, and the slums were built on top of that land. And since nobody was paying attention to that public space, people just filled it. And companies did that also, like they'll show you with PepsiCo and Coca-Cola. They moved their fences up to the river edge because it was a land that nobody, the government, the state wouldn't claim. So why wouldn't they use it? If the companies have not moved, another slum would have been there.
And the rule here was that we're clearing back from the river 35 meters, right?
Yeah.
The strip 35 meters, and then putting a park or highways or other public space.
Yeah, that was a ruling by the first judge. His name is Luis Armela, and he rescued a very old part of the civil code that mandated 35 meters from the edge of the river onto the land for the boats to be able to be carried by donkeys and
to make a towpath, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, although we don't need that because we have motors.
But it gives you a very nice park. Right?
Yeah, yeah, and on a road on the other side of the river. So it gives connectivity. That's another thing about Riachuelo. The society didn't know how Riachuelo really looked like. They knew La Boca, but they didn't know anything about further up the river because it was hidden by companies and by slums. Now that the space is being opened up, we can really appreciate what this river looks like. And I think the most fascinating part of the river is exactly where this big slum is located. And it's wild, it's full of nature, it has a big meander, and that's so beautiful. And it really could be a very nice public place for people to enjoy, really.
In a sense, this whole process is giving the river back to the city, right?
Yes.
Back to the citizens.
Yes, the city can reclaim its river that has been so neglected. Yes, it's fascinating. I was in Spain doing, like 2 years ago, doing the story on how the city of Bilbao reclaimed the river. It's called Ria something, I don't know, Ria del Nervión. That was totally polluted by industrial waste and human waste, and they reclaim it. And now it's a very highly appreciated European city that even holds a Guggenheim Museum. And this is because they reclaimed the Ria del Nervión. And the whole city used to look to the other side, and now the whole city is looking onto the Ria because it's so pretty, because a waterway always makes it a city prettier. And I think that can happen to the Riachuelo. I hope this happens.
That would be success.
That would be success. It's exactly what Antolin said this morning, when society reclaims the river for itself, not for a group of NGOs, but for the whole society. But it's more than the quality of the water. It's about the quality of the industrial processes. It's about the quality of the public place. It's about the quality of the housing. It's about so many, many different things. It's about how garbage gets picked up. It's about how we deal with human waste. It's about so many other things than the water itself. So this is a very nice story, very complex.
Fascinating story. And also, we've been hearing, it's a bit of an example, right?
It is, because there are many other rivers in Latin America that should be cleaned up. And this is a very nice precedent. For instance, the government of Colombia was here to look at how this process is going. And since it's a mix of a judicial, social, economic process, it's really worth for the world to start coming and look at it, because it is interesting. Maybe it's not perfect, but the imperfection makes it look more interesting.
Well, and also, you know, it's an example, isn't it, of there aren't many times when a whole society kind of works together on a common objective, but this involves the courts, it involves civil society, it involves 3 levels of government, it involves private enterprise, it involves, you know, I suppose the legislature and so on.
And poor people.
And poor people, rich people, all kinds of people.
Big companies, powerful companies, small companies. You have everybody here. because the Riachuelo is a mirror of the territory.
Yes.
So the whole territory has to play into the story for it to be cleaned up.
And so what Buenos Aires learns, or what Argentina learns from this, is something that applies everywhere, which is that you can bring all these components together and make big changes about problems that you recognize have been stuck in.
Exactly, and that you can promote sustainable development too. We have other polluted rivers in Argentina. Argentina is a very big country, and with heavy urban areas and with heavy industries, agricultural and heavy industry. So this is providing a good example for other basins in the country and outside the country, and it's interesting.
Marina Aizen, award-winning journalist and author of Contaminados, a book on the cleanup of Argentina's Riachuelo River. Alas, it hasn't been translated into English. But if you find that story as interesting as I do, you may want to look at our interview with Daniel Salaberry, the lawyer who argued the Mendoza case before the Supreme Court of Argentina and won. We also have an interview with Pablo Fiardo, the young Ecuadorian lawyer who won a $9.5 billion judgment against Chevron for its contamination of 1,500 square miles of the Amazon rainforest. You might also enjoy our interviews with David Boyd and Cormac Cullinan, both of whom have written books about your right to a healthy environment and Mother Nature's right to be respected and protected. For the Green Interview, I'm Silver Donald Cameron. Thanks for watching.